Gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of What's Happening. I'm George Binns, and the guest this evening is the Superintendent of Schools, Dr. Susan Charochak, and the Director of Opportunity Access and Equity, Dr. Andre Morgan. Hey, welcome, folks. I appreciate you stopping by for us.
Yeah,
Many
thanks for
thanks.
having us.
Fill people in on the background. This is the fourth show we've done on this series. It started out just introducing Dr. Morgan, and then we got into a little bit about what his function is. And one of the issues came up was what's the opportunity? Well, that gets us into a discussion of what's the curriculum. And we had a show that we did with the Assistant Superintendent of Schools, Dr. Dorothy Flannery, and the principal of the high school, Elizabeth Taylor, talking about what the curriculum is in the schools. And this got to be a little farther than just the high school. We went through everything right down to the elementary school level, especially on STEM. That's one of my favorite subjects. And now we want to get back to the question of what's Andre Morgan doing in town. And we got into a little bit of the access question with the assistant superintendent. And one of the issues that came up, and this is another one of my favorites, is a lot of kids just don't have access to Essex Tech. So that, I think, is a real serious discussion that needs to be had again sometime else, not tonight. So after we get past that access, Andre, what else do you worry about in the world of access?
Well, I think, George, before I tackle that directly, if you'll allow me, I'd like to take a walk back to defining what opportunity, access, and equity really is. Let me also throw in that it's great to come back to the show to discuss the district's work around these areas. So the three areas, prescriptively, are not synonymous. Each term does while it correlates with the other, they don't mean the same thing. So when we talk about opportunity, we're really talking about the methods by which we create opportunities for students to address socioeconomic status, English proficiency, familial situations, and other factors that contribute to or perpetuate low academic achievement. When we're talking about access, we're talking about the pathways by which we help each student to gain exposure to opportunities for success. And then as we look at equity, it means for us giving every student what he or she needs to be successful. And so as we talk about our work in these three areas, you may hear our responses mention an equity audit, which the district undertook. And I want to note that the equity audit is not a be-all, end-all to our work around opportunity, access, and equity. It's a tool that we're using to guide our attention and planning to ensure equitable access for all students.
Well, what was, in 25 words or less, what was the results of the equity audit?
25 words or less, George. That's going to be tricky, even for me, who I like to try to shorten things. Before we go on, can I just say one more thing about the opportunity, access, and equity? Because I think Beverly has taken a somewhat unique approach. There are a lot of districts around us and a lot of municipalities and a lot of organizations who are, really taking a close look at bringing someone into their district to look at equity and look at, they call DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think. When we put our position together, we spent a lot of time really thinking about what was the role going to be, because we were expanding our cabinet, and something that we really felt like we needed to do for a long time, not just around one issue of equity. And so Andre's role in Beverly, I think, is a little broader than in some of the other communities. And we did that by taking a look and defining that opportunity, access, and equity, because we believe that the work that needs to be done is embedded in our curriculum. So George, your work and your discussions with Dr. Flaherty and Mrs. Taylor around the curriculum, is our curriculum representative of all of our students? And do all of our students have access to all levels of our curriculum, whether it's AP classes or advanced coursework? And so I think we made a purposeful attempt to title the position to kind of represent what we believe is that this isn't a one-time thing. The equity audit isn't a one-time thing. Looking at equity isn't a one-time thing. And it's not Andre's job to just come in and tell us what we should do to be more equitable. We think that this position is really helping us in the district peel apart some of the barriers that might exist, some of the areas that we may be perpetuating, whether it's schedule, whether it's, there are so many things that we perpetuate that keep us locked into some of these things that create barriers for some students. And so I just wanted to take a minute. I love the way that Dr. Morgan described those three terms. And I think it's really important that if we don't take a holistic approach to how we are running our schools and what we're doing in our school buildings, then we're not going to be able to achieve that level of equity that, that we have as our vision. So I just wanted to take a moment and share that, if that was okay.
Well, one of the things that bothers me is the concept of equity. When I bought a house, got a mortgage, and paid it off over 25 years. And little by little, I owned more of my house and the bank owned less. That was my equity. Mm-hmm. And this use of the equity in terms of something else, I think is a little hard for me to understand. I think for a lot of people to understand. It's a new version of what equity is. So I think
that's interesting. I think, for those of us that have been, sort of based in a really traditional model of education, or in a lot of things, we always use sort of the word equality, right? Which meant the same for everyone. And I think equity takes us on that leap from the same doesn't work for everyone, but giving everyone what they need is what we mean by equity, right? Making sure that we are meeting the needs of all students, however they come into the learning environment, and that understanding that in order to do that, it may not be the same across the board, or our traditional methods may need to shift and change so that we're better able to meet the needs of all of our kids.
Well, I think that's kind of obvious when you go back to the access issue I brought up when we started, that there are a lot of students who are tactile learners. It's a fancy name for, hey, I pick it up with my hands and I can feel it, I can understand it. And that's how my brain processes this information. And the obvious place for them is a trade school. And I've written before that if I wasn't good in mathematics, I would have ended up in a trade school just like my father. And
I think one of the things that you're kind of coming closer to, and I think the approach that we're talking about in Beverly is similar to that, but I don't think that it means that someone has to go to a different school. But I do think we need to think about our pedagogy and the way that we're doing things. If you think about the high school schedule, we've created a block schedule where there are 84 minutes. So those of us that had a 47-minute, 7-block schedule when we went to high school, there was, a lot of lecture, right? And a lot of stage on the stage. And so in 84 minutes, you would have lost me if I had to sit in a classroom for 84 minutes and have one form of instruction, which would have been lecture or something more traditional. And so I think when we talk about that, exactly what you're talking about, some people, we need different kinds of ways. We need to mostly infuse some collaboration and some discourse, right? And some of those skills that are really important for our students. But now think about that and add in a lens of cultural responsive, right? Being culturally responsive to students that are in our classrooms and understanding, some of the strategies that work best with learners for whom English isn't a first language, or that there, some of those different pieces, and understanding a changing and shifting world where no longer is it a one parent household where mom's home waiting with a snack to help you with your homework at the end of the day. But now we have lots of different households that we live in and come from, and two parents, it's the rare family that has a parent home waiting at the end of the day for a student for that. And so what do we need to do? How do we support kids? How do we help kids in this way? And then throw in on top of all of that, the pandemic and the need for social emotional supports that kids might have. So we have a lot of challenges that are in front of us that we have to balance to make sure that we're meeting the needs of kids in a way that everybody has that same opportunity to succeed in school, the same opportunity to take advantage of all of the things that are offered, whether they be advanced coursework or extracurricular, and making sure that there aren't barriers to that, and that we're not putting in and actually defining what those barriers are.
Well, you're raising some very good questions of how do we meet the kid at the door with the characteristics the kid brings with him, and not try to create a situation where you fit the mold or you're out of luck, which is the traditional system of teacher stands up for 45 minutes, stand and deliver.
My way or the highway, right?
Yeah.
So your original
some good questions, but what are some of the good answers that Beverly is involved in? How do you guys do it?
Yeah, so I think your original question of what did we discover through the equity audit is really the beginning. So what we decided that in order to address it and to make sure that we're doing what we need to do, first we need to identify who are our learners, what are those barriers, what are those, and let the data drive us into some conversations and discussions about why does it look this way. So some of the things that we discovered in our audit, I think the one that I hold probably most dear right now, and I'm trying to make a real commitment to, is that if you look at the makeup of our advanced coursework, there is a subgroup of students, namely white students, who are not economically disadvantaged, who are easily accessing those courses. And they're disproportionate in the number of students who might be economically disadvantaged, or students of color, or students whose first language is not English. And so that's an access issue, right? We have some students who are able to access this advanced coursework and other students who are not. And the real question that
it gets down to the question again, why have they got access to it and the other students don't? What is the difference between the students that makes access reasonable or not? Dr. Morgan, what did you find from that study?
Well, I'm going to answer this a couple of different ways, but the first way I'm going to answer is giving you a direct answer to the question that you asked me when the show began, and that was, why am I in town? And so I'm in town to help partner with Dr. Charochak and the leadership team in the district, really to making a meaningful difference in the lives of students of all creeds, colors, and backgrounds. I think there's no arguing that the most important element of a quality education are the interactions between student and teacher and the type of coursework that students are exposed to during their time in the system. We want to make sure that from an access standpoint that every student, again, regardless of their creed, their color, their background, has the opportunity to have the same opportunities for courses that will make a difference in their life trajectories down the line. One of the things that I've heard Dr. Charochak comment on, a while back was that it's our goal as a district leadership, if you will, to build capacity in the district, to ensure that every student experience is meaningful, and with their teachers, that it leads to genuine learning. And so therefore, as leaders throughout the system, we really are tasked to continually to address policies and protocols and practices and resources that lead to a more effective teaching and learning environment. The reality is the building equity is the first step towards impactful teaching and learning. Notice I didn't say effective, but impactful. What leads to differences? And so, in fact, it's a principal concept that teachers learn early on. that the importance of differentiated instruction really could serve as a case study for the importance of equity in itself. So imagine a teacher whose lessons plans consist solely of lectures. He or she tests the students and feels satisfied when only 1/3 of the class earns a passing grade. Teacher believes that his or her teaching method was fair because all the students receive the same information in the same way. So this teaching method can't be considered effective or even impactful because we understand that students learn in different ways. Teachers build equity in instructional practices when they use various methods to teach, so that learners, regardless of how they learn and their interactions, have the same access to learning as everyone else. And so in that sense, differentiated instruction really is a building block to equity. And that's one of the things that we learned through the audit, that our system, must differentiate resources, practices, and opportunities for schools, much like a teacher differentiates instructions for student success. So while equality and equity are not synonymous, equality is easy to dole out with its premise, but achieving equity is much more complex. That's also what we learned in the audit, and it really calls for empathy and demands an understanding of truth.
Well, the other question that comes to mind is when you look at demographics, everybody wants to deal in demographics in terms of ethnic background and says, that's it. But what you're implying, or what I understand from what you're saying, is there's more to the demographics of the students than simply where did their parents come from. And I think where you start to get into these issues of the tactile learners, which is one of my favorite buzzwords, students that have a different degree of educational acumen, they can pick it up, they can't pick it up, they pick it up a different way. The lack of English language as a first language is a handicap. I know I've struggled all my life trying to learn a different language and have enough trouble with English. And I think, what's the system look like? What kind of a spread are you guys working with? What's the real characteristic of the student body?
Well, do you mean, in terms of data, you can look on the website and the DESE website and see some data points around, the Department of Ed will categorize a lot of subgroups by a category. So first, I think we have I saw yesterday, 37% of our students are categorized as economically disadvantaged, and 28% are economically disadvantaged, 31%, and I'm saying these off the top of my head, so I might be off a percentage or two. We have a population of students who are considered high needs. That means they fall into one or another category, and that percentage runs around 41% for Beverly. So that means that when you're looking at a class of, say there were 10 kids in front of you, 4 of our students may have learning differences of some kind. They may have be in another subgroup that measures that way. But that doesn't also account for, as you were talking about, people who learn differently, right? So one of the things that we're doing and the way that we address that, and Andre mentioned the word differentiated instruction, and that basically means that when we're designing our lessons, we are now being purposeful and intentful in taking a look at how many ways are we asking students to be able to express themselves, right? So we look at the multiple means of expression. We look at how are we measuring growth for kids as from a beginning point to an end point. So we're utilizing data in a way that helps us make sure that each student is moving in a positive direction, and that we're trying to make sure they have an opportunity to see and hear the information in a number of different ways. And then the other side of the coin is our emphasis on project-based learning and making sure there's relevance in what we're teaching. Because for a lot of students, if there's no connection to relevant learning, then they're not as able to kind of stay in the classroom and keep pace with what some of the things they're being asked to do. So.
Well, one of the things that came out of some of the discussions we had with candidates for the school committee about a year ago was the emphasis in this particular area on biotech and healthcare is a strong characteristics of this area. So it seems to me an obvious solution that, hey, if you're going to get the kids in this area ready for some kind of local opportunity, there needs to be a very strong biology, biotech program. And one of the things when I was teaching in a K through 8 school, had access to New England biolabs. I could take my 7th grade life science class over there once a year, and they would put on a demonstration for us. Well, biolabs moved out of town and they're coming back. Maybe they'll continue to do this. But is this something the system does? Do you have access to, say, cell signaling or some of these other opportunities in town to get students in there, get their hands on something, see what it's really like? Let them.
I don't know. Did Mrs. Taylor mention when she was on your show earlier about the pathways? So that's what we're calling them, pathways, right? We believe that when we're in it within our high school curriculum, we're hoping and working with developing specific pathways for students, so that if you have an interest in the health field, that we help design a curriculum pathway for you through the high school that prepares you for work in that area. And in that would include some expeditionary learning, right? And so we are reaching out and trying to find community partners to work with. We have obvious ones in a health pathway, Beverly Hospital, other things like that. We are developing those pathways as we speak. I will say that this past Friday, I had an opportunity to walk through the Senior Reach Internship Program showcase. And our seniors in their last quarter of their senior year right now go out into the community and, they get internships and they work in those areas. And there were so many of our students who had opportunities to work in some of the local businesses and some of the local industries. And actually, several of them have attained a summer job as a result of their internship, right? So they went in and they were doing an internship, and it actually turned into a summer work opportunity. So I am with you 100%. I think we have a multitude of resources within our very own community, local to us, so that we can continue to grow and build. Cell signaling has been a great partner for some of our schools in terms of grant opportunities and some of those things as well. In our younger school, our elementary schools, there's a program called Science for Scientists, where people who are working in the field come in and they're working with our schools, talking about science in the field of science and the opportunities that are available there. So, all of those things really, I think you're exactly identifying what we think is really important as well.
Well, get back to Dr. Morgan. I guess the question keeps coming up of exactly what are we doing? Exactly, part of this discussion is in your particular jargon, and it makes sense to the two of you. And some of the phrasing you're using is a little confusing to me in terms of what do you mean by some of these things? So in relatively plain English, what's your goal in terms of your 3 challenges of opportunity, access, and equity? How would you describe the situation that you would say, hey, I did my job and I did it well?
Great question. And so I'm going to answer it using the analogy of a comment that I heard from a couple of our students on the playground a couple of weeks ago. And so one of the 2 students were playing, and one of the students commented that something wasn't fair. That kind of stuck with me a little bit. The idea that, something wasn't fair. And this is language that students are taught from an early age. And so, like children on the playground, I think adults recognize that unjust practices exist when we see them. And the question is, will we as educators be brave enough to shout out, hey, that's not fair? Maybe that was one of the purposes of our equity audit, to be able to do just that. And the follow-up question being, are we committed enough to take action and make change? So what is this really about? This is about us making change. You know, education is a system that was developed based on a factory model, meaning that kids learn the same things in the same way, and this process occurred each day. And as student needs began to evolve, we recognized that we can't continue education in a factory model system. And so the approach that Dr. Charochak discussed, the pathways that are being offered in high school, you know, really support this idea of personalized learning, that is, tapping into each student's academic talents and potential and interests and passions that allow us to get away from the factory model and to begin helping to prepare students for jobs that don't even yet exist, quite honestly. Yeah. And so that's our purpose. That's what we're doing. We're saying that, hey, you know, there are things that will better help students of all backgrounds, and we're bold enough to take the pivot and to move in those types of directions. And so that's what you see when you, that's what you're hearing when you're listening to our responses. But I certainly have to take a moment, and I just feel led to do this, if you will, but I want to give kudos to Dr. Charochak for her leadership, because the reality is that a vision for equity really starts at the top. And all educators owe it to their students, their districts, and their communities to explore their assumptions, knowledge, and skills with a willingness to change. And I think Dr. Charochak stands that up each and every day. It stood up in my being here in the district and being able to partner and work to make sure that all students get a fair shake what their future trajectories look like.
Sounds good. And believe it or not, we've had a half hour of fun. And want to thank you both for joining us this evening and helping understand where we're going. And I think one of these times we're going to have to do it again, because I think there's more to talk about. And I would like to get into a little more about what's happened with the audit, especially when you do it again. And has there been any change? And I think that's the real issue of, yes, a one-shot deal, you take a picture, a snapshot, and say, hey, that's where we're at. And you find things I'm not too keen on that. And we get another audit and say, hey, did we make any improvement? And that's what I think everybody wants to hear, that, yeah, we made a difference. And once again, thanks for joining us. And we'll have to do this again. I hope you'll join me.
Thanks for having us. It was nice.
Thanks for having us. Looking forward.